Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a really quite thought-provoking piece today. It's chapter 19, Whom He Will Love, from Zafarullah Khan's book, Islam in the Contemporary World, a New Narrative.
Right. And he starts off with a pretty striking observation, doesn't he?
He does. He paints this picture of Islam as potentially the last mercy of the Lord for mankind.
Yeah.
You know, full of this immense potential.
Then the contrast comes.
Exactly. He contrasts that with how it's often, well, perceived or maybe practiced today, where it can get associated with things like exploitation, poverty, even terror.
And that gap, that contrast is really the hook, isn't it? Khan is basically asking, how can something seen as having so much potential end up looking so disconnected from, well, positive outcomes in some context?
Yeah. So this deep dive is all about exploring his perspective on that question. We're sticking just to this chapter, this source.
That's right. Our mission here is really to guide you, the listener, through his diagnosis, what he thinks went wrong, why, and what he's proposing as part of this new narrative he talks about. We're just trying to pull out the key ideas from this text.
Okay, so where does Khan start then? How does he begin to explain that gap between the potential and the reality he's describing? What's his, fundamental diagnosis?
Well, he really points to a core issue of stagnation. He argues that Muslims are, in his words, essentially stuck to the past.
Stuck? How so?
Stuck in the sense that they haven't been able to evolve effectively. And the reason he gives for this, a lack of real ijtehad.
Ijtehad, that's the independent reasoning, the interpretation.
Exactly. That process needed to apply Islamic principles to, modern life, contemporary challenges.
And if you don't have that, if you lack that ability to adapt and reason things out.
Well, according to Khan, it stops Muslims from creating what he calls a truly Islamic modern existence. And the consequence of that is, well, a failure to live a peaceful and prosperous life, and ultimately to achieve their full potential.
That sounds pretty serious.
It is. And he adds a very stark warning, too, referencing the Quran, chapter 9, verse 24. He suggests this failure to reform, to engage properly, could lead to, major hardships or even, and this is quite strong, being substituted by a new people.
Wow. So he's really framing this as an urgent need for change.
Absolutely. It underscores the seriousness of his call for a new approach.
So if stagnation is the problem, where does he look within Islam itself for the principles needed to sort of get unstuck and move forward?
He highlights what he sees as Islam's two kind of fundamental dimensions. First, there's the Zahir.
Zahir, the apparent, the external.
Exactly. Think Sharia, the basic legal framework, the rituals, the outward practices we can see.
Okay. And the second dimension?
That's the batin, the inner dimension. This is often linked with tazkiyat-i-nafs, which is purification of the soul, and Tasawwuf.
Tasawwuf, that's mysticism or Sufism.
Right, that's the common term.
So that you have the structure, the Zahir, and then the spirit, the batin. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Khan argues the ultimate purpose, the real goal, is profoundly spiritual. It's about creating that link between man and his creator.
Okay.
So while the Sharia provides the essential rules for living, the structure, Tasawwuf, the batin, is what speaks to that deep human desire for spiritual connection, for moral refinement.
And what's at the very heart of this genuine inner dimension, this batin, according to Khan? What defines it?
Love. Simple as that. Specifically, a passionate love for Allah, for God.
Okay, love for God.
But, and this is critical in his view, this love for the Creator has to flow outwards. It naturally becomes love for his creatures.
So it's not just an internal feeling.
No, not at all. He quotes the Quran again, 5.54, whom he would love as they would love him. It's reciprocal and it's demonstrated. It's not just about receiving God's love. It's about actively showing that love through how you treat others, how you interact with the world.
He gives a couple of examples, doesn't he, to illustrate this kind of active, outward love that's rooted in spirituality?
Yes, he does. The story about Baba Farid Gan Shakar is quite telling.
The scissors.
That's the one. Someone gives him scissors, a tool for cutting, for dividing. And his response, he wished instead for needle and thread that sews and joins.
Ah, so bringing things together, not separating them.
Precisely. Khan uses this to illustrate the character of a genuinely spiritual person, someone who heals divisions, builds unity, and actually spreads the message through caring social behavior, not through conflict or force. Decreasing enmity, as he puts it.
And there's the poem, too, Abu Ben Adam.
Right, by Leigh Hunt. He cites that as well.
How does that fit in?
Well, in the poem, the angel is writing down the names of those who love God. Abu asks if his name is there. It isn't. So he asks the angel to write him down as one who loves his fellow men. The next night, the angel returns and shows about that his name now leads all the rest, those whom God loves. So it directly backs up Khan's point. Loving God's creation is presented as a direct pathway to and measure of loving God himself.
I see. So it reinforces that idea that genuine spirituality has this very practical, outward-facing, loving dimension.
Exactly. And that's a core part of the new narrative he seems to be advocating for, that Islam, in its spiritual essence, is about connection, love, and positive engagement with the world.
Okay, so he sets up this beautiful potential of the batin, this genuine Tasawwuf focused on love and connection. But then he takes quite a sharp turn, doesn't he? He starts critiquing a distorted form of Sufism.
He does. And this is where his diagnosis of the problem really gets specific.
How did something seemingly so positive go wrong in his analysis?
He argues that, over time, a later form of Sufism emerged that drifted away from these core principles. He got influenced, he says, by ideas that weren't really authentically Islamic.
And instead of promoting love and engagement,
It started advocating for something very different: renunciation and seclusion.
withdrawing from the world entirely, that sounds like the complete opposite of the Baba Farid story.
It is. And Khan argues this shift had really severe negative consequences, not just for individuals, but for the whole society.
That's so.
He brings in the perspective of Muhammad Iqbal, the poet-philosopher. Iqbal observed, way back in 1934, that this spirit of total otherworldliness, this withdrawal, was actually a major factor in the decline of Muslim societies, especially after events like the fall of Baghdad.
Why? What was the mechanism?
Because, according to Iqbal, it absorbed the best minds. The most intelligent, capable people were drawn into these private spiritual retreats, focusing solely inward,
Leaving what?
leaving the practical affairs, state matters, science, society, to those Iqbal rather bluntly called the intellectual mediocre.
Wow. So it wasn't just a personal spiritual choice impacting the individual. It was draining the intellectual and practical talent from the community's engagement with the world.
Precisely. And Khan links this directly to another major negative outcome he identifies: fostering an unscientific, rather anti-science temperament.
How does that follow?
By overemphasizing the inner dimension, the batin, and effectively neglecting or even devaluing the outer world, the zahir, it discouraged intellectual curiosity about the physical world, empirical observation, scientific inquiry.
He makes a comparison, doesn't he, between Sufis and scientists?
Yes, it's quite a striking comparison.
Yeah.
He lists major historical Sufi figures like Rumi or Hindi alongside Western scientists from roughly corresponding periods: Bacon, Kepler, Newton.
What's the point of that comparison?
His point isn't to diminish the Sufi spiritual stature. It's to highlight what he sees as a profound absence of comparable scientific engagement and advancement within Muslim societies during those key periods. And he attributes this imbalance, at least partly, to this distorted, inward-looking spiritual mindset that devalued worldly knowledge.
Okay, so where did these specific ideas like extreme renunciation and this anti-science attitude actually come from, according to Khan? He mentions outside influences.
Yeah, he traces some of it to what he considers non-Islamic philosophical sources. He mentions figures like Plotinus, the Neoplatonist philosopher, and also points to practices found in Hindu traditions of renunciation.
And these influences brought in ideas that didn't quite fit.
He argues they introduced doctrines that clashed with what he sees as Islam's inherent balance, the balance between matter and spirit, between this world and the next. And this led, he says, to two really damaging trends within this distorted Sufism. First, asceticism and renunciation, and second, irrationality.
Okay, let's take asceticism and renunciation first. What was the harm there, specifically?
Well, in practice, it meant neglecting or even abandoning the social, political, and economic teachings that are actually a core part of Islam. The focus shifted dramatically
From what to what?
from community life, collective responsibility, and improving society, towards intense, individual spiritual exercises, often done completely alone, cut off from others. He contrasts this sharply with Islam's emphasis on communal worship, like praying together in congregation.
So it privatized spirituality too much.
That's his argument. That distorted Sufism pushed spirituality into, as he puts it, a silent corner of a khanqa, a Sufi lodge, weakening the very communal bonds and collective action that Islam otherwise strongly encourages.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the second trend he mentioned? Irrationality. How does that play into his critique?
This is really crucial for understanding his point about stagnation and the lack of ijtehad, that independent reasoning.
Right.
This distorted view started to prioritize mystical experience, intuition, maybe even dreams, over intellect and reason as the main way to get knowledge.
So feeling overthinking.
In a way, yes. Khan points to a quote often attributed to Rumi, something about throwing away books and turning your heart solely to the beloved. He argues this kind of sentiment got misinterpreted.
Misinterpreted how? To cause harm?
It fostered, in his view, a widespread anti-intellectual attitude, a sort of deliberate turning away from books and knowledge.
And the danger of that.
Khan says it made Muslims vulnerable to absorbing other philosophies, things he considers un-Islamic, without critical assessment. This led to confusion, a kind of blending or syncretism.
Like mixing things up.
Yes, like confusing basic Islamic concepts with ideas from other traditions. He gives the example of blurring Ram and Rahim, Karma and Kareem, often through adopting pantheistic ideas.
Yeah.
He sees this as directly undermining the intellectual rigor needed for proper ijtihad and for engaging effectively with the modern world.
He singles out one doctrine as causing the greatest harm. That's the idea of negation of self, or fana.
Yes, fana fil sheikh,
Yep.
annihilation in the guide. Fana fil Rasul in the Prophet, fana fil Allah in God.
What's the core problem with this concept of fana, as Khan presents it here?
He views it extremely negatively, calling it annihilative psychological thinking.
Annihilative.
Yes. He argues it works against personal freedom, it hinders individual growth and evolution. Why? Because the goal becomes to extinguish the self, to dissolve one's individual identity.
And taken to an extreme.
It can lead to a problematic kind of pantheism, where the seeker comes to believe they literally merge with or become part of God's essence, losing their own distinctiveness.
Is there a counterexample?
He contrasts this sharply with the stance taken by Ahmad Sirhindi, a very influential historical figure who actively resisted this idea. Sirhindi affirmed the believer's separate identity while still emphasizing complete reliance on God.
So, for Khan, maintaining that sense of self is important.
Absolutely crucial. For Khan, what he calls the affirmation of self, having a strong, distinct individual identity, is essential for doing meaningful creative work, for being productive, for self-actualization in this world. And that's precisely what he feels is lost in this doctrine of fana.
And this idea seems closely related to another issue. He raises the personality cult that can form around spiritual guides, the sheikhs.
Yes, they're definitely linked. This excessive reverence, the almost blind devotion to a sheikh, is another major point of his critique.
Why is that so problematic?
Because, Khan argues, it actively discourages inquiry, research, and education. If the sheikh is seen as infallible, why question? Why investigate for yourself?
Right.
He highlights the emergence of what he calls a truly un-Islamic concept, the claim that sainthood was superior to prophethood.
Wait, that sounds backwards in Islamic terms.
Completely. He attributes this specific saying to Bahzadid Bustami, noting it might have been said in some kind of ecstatic state, but the problem was it got turned into a doctrine that elevates human spiritual guides above the Prophet Muhammad himself, totally inverting the proper Islamic hierarchy of authority.
That quote he uses about obeying the mentor even if he orders wine, that really hammers home the potential danger, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It's attributed to Shirazi, and it illustrates just how far this unquestioning loyalty could go. The focus shifts dramatically from obeying God and his revealed guidance.
To absolute submission to a human teacher.
Exactly. Potentially leading people to do things directly against Islamic law, all justified by the idea that the sheikh knows the roads that lead to God better than you, or even better than the revealed texts. This is the kind of distortion Khan sees as causing immense problems.
He also talks about another consequence. People declaring things forbidden, haram, when they're actually permissible halal in Islam, often in the name of being extra pious.
Right. He brings up that incident from the Quran, chapter 66, verse 1. It's where the Prophet Muhammad himself was gently corrected by Allah for deciding to abstain from honey.
Why? Honey isn't forbidden, is it?
No, not at all. But the Prophet had made a personal vow to avoid it for certain reasons. The subtle point Khan draws from the Quranic verse is that Allah framed even the Prophet's personal restriction as potentially contrary to the broader principle of enjoying the good things God has made permissible.
So the message is, don't make things harder than they need to be.
Exactly. Khan uses it to show that Islam, even at the level of the Prophet, doesn't endorse making permissible things forbidden just for the sake of extreme asceticism.
which connects directly to his critique of those extreme ascetic practices themselves.
Precisely. Islam consistently promotes moderation, the middle path. The Prophet very clearly discouraged practices like, say, fasting every single day of the year or praying all night long without any sleep. There's that well-known hadith about Abdullah bin Amr who was doing that, and the Prophet corrected him.
Finding balance.
Yes. And Khan draws a really stark contrast here. He gives these vivid, almost uncomfortable examples of extreme asceticism from historical Christian traditions.
Like what?
Like St. Macrolus standing in freezing mud, St. Eustace living in a dry well, St. Anthony apparently not washing his feet for years. He describes these very physical, harsh forms of self-denial.
And his point is?
His point is that this is not the Islamic way. Yet he observes that some individuals in the Muslim world, whom he calls malang, maybe translated loosely as spiritual eccentrics or lunatics, adopt similar extremes.
And he disapproves.
Strongly. He dismisses it as spiritual lunacy. He believes it's often based on misinterpreting dreams or even psychological delusions, and fundamentally deviates from Islam's emphasis on things like cleanliness, physical health, and balance in life.
Okay, so that's a pretty comprehensive diagnosis of the problems Khan sees, largely rooted in distortions of spirituality. What then is his proposed solution? How does he suggest Muslims arise out of deep slumber and reform themselves, as he puts it?
His way forward is quite direct. First, he says Muslims must actively purge Sufism, Tasawwuf, of these un-Islamic concepts and practices that have crept in.
Clean house, basically.
Yes. And crucially, he insists that the tariqah, the Sufi path or method, must always be subordinate to Sharia, the foundational Islamic law.
Restoring that balance again between the inner path and the outer framework.
Exactly. It's about bringing them back into proper alignment. And this means returning to what he terms the prophetic way.
What does that entail, the prophetic way?
It means living among people, not withdrawn from them, actively working for their betterment, cultivating and, importantly, radiating high moral character in your daily interactions. Undergoing spiritual training, yes, but doing it while fully engaged for the world and its challenges.
So it's about living out those spiritual principles within the community, not just in isolation.
Precisely. It also requires developing discernment, distinguishing genuine spiritual experiences from psychological maladies.
That seems important, given his critique of spiritual lunacy.
Very. It's also about nurturing core values like love for humanity and humility, dedicating oneself in the cause of Allah, yes, but, and here's that point about the self again, finding affirmation of individuality and the collectivity of life.
So maintain a strong sense of self, but use it to contribute to the community, not seeking self-annihilation.
That's the idea. He really emphasizes that for him, genuine spirituality isn't found in becoming a hermit. It lies in obtaining spiritual knowledge of God and offering obedience to the messenger of Allah, lived out in the real world.
Now, given this really strong critique of how Sufism got distorted, does Khan just sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater? Does he discard the whole idea of spiritual training, of Tasawwuf? Or does he still see value there?
No, he definitely doesn't discard it entirely. He absolutely sees immense positive potential in genuine Sufism, the kind that aligns with the Sharia and the prophetic way.
Especially in today's world.
Yes. He specifically mentions its ability to provide balance in a world that's often just obsessed with material comforts. He argues that when it's practiced correctly, the right way, it offers really powerful benefits.
Okay, so what are some of those benefits of genuine spirituality, as Khan lays them out?
Well, first and foremost, it teaches that essential foundation, the love of and obedience to the Creator, striving to, worship God as if we see Him, while knowing that even if we don't see Him, He sees us. That constant awareness.
Right.
It helps Muslims stick closely to the Prophet Muhammad's lifestyle, his sunnah, and his values.
Does it help with, perception? Seeing things more clearly?
Yes. He says it enables one to see beyond the superficial distractions, the veils of darkness, and to see things as they truly are. It teaches that crucial skill of being in the world, but not of this world.
Participating fully, but without getting lost in materialism.
Exactly. It instills purity of sight, purity of the soul.
And ethical behavior.
Definitely. It cultivates virtues like love, affection, justice. And importantly, it equips you to avoid being manipulated or exploiting others or being dishonest. It fosters respect, reverence, service to others, treating everyone equally. And that extends, he notes, to love for all human beings and even for the environment.
What about managing our own internal stuff, our flaws?
That's a big part of it too. He says genuine spiritual training helps control those negative traits that hold us back, both personally and socially. Things like arrogance, greed, impatience, anger, vanity.
And the payoff.
Ultimately, he argues, it's the path to finding real, lasting happiness. How? By freeing the mind from the constant pull of greed, from the demands of the ego, from vanity, and also from being crippled by anxiety about the past or fear of the future.
So it sounds like it builds a kind of inner strength, resilience that helps you navigate life better.
It really does. He emphasizes the teaching of patience, Saber, and he uses that Rumi quote again, but in a positive context this time.
Which one?
The one about God teaching us through opposites, pain and pleasure, happiness and sorrow. Why? Rumi says, so you will have two wings to fly, not one.
So embracing the ups and downs gives you balance.
That's the idea. This balance, learned through genuine spiritual discipline, allows you to navigate all the complexities life throws at you with, hopefully, more grace and effectiveness.
You know, this whole deep dive into Khan's chapter, it really brings us right back to where he started, doesn't it? To his
Right.
core message, that the future for Muslims, and maybe how Islam itself is perceived, really hinges on deciding how we want to be in this world. And showing that through actions and deeds, it feels like a powerful call for fundamental self-reform.
It is. That's the crux of his argument here. He's laid out his case that Islam's immense potential, including its deep spiritual side, has been seriously hampered by these distortions, by this failure to properly engage with the present. For him, understanding where things went wrong, these historical and theological missteps, is absolutely essential if you want to build that positive new narrative he's calling for.
It certainly gives you, the listener, a lot to think about regarding that interplay between, your inner spiritual life and your outward actions in the world.
It really does. And it leads to a final thought, perhaps. If, as Kant suggests here, true spirituality needs this careful balance between the inner journey, the batin, and active engagement with the world through the zahir or sharia, and also balance between your own individual spiritual growth and how you contribute to the life of the community. Well, how might pursuing that kind of balance look different in your life today? And that's regardless of your own background or beliefs. How can any tradition really effectively bridge that gap between deep personal reflection and meaningful outward action that actually benefits society as a whole?